Some truths are better left buried, but I didn't listen. I thought I was chasing a story, a curiosity to satisfy my skeptical mind. Now I can't unhear her voice. I can't escape the weight of her whispers, the shadow of her presence. And I wish I could tell you it's just a story. I wish I could tell myself that. But I've learned the hard way that some stories don't end, they only wait. I wasn't always like this, paranoid, restless, watching shadows stretch too far in the corners of my vision. Once I prided myself on being the voice of reason, the skeptic who laughed at ghost stories, who dismissed superstitions as relics of an overactive imagination. I sought out legends, not because I believed in them, but because I didn't. Folklore was a puzzle to me, an exercise in unraveling the irrational. Haunted houses, optical illusions, poltergeists, unchecked anxiety, demonic possessions, a cocktail of sleep paralysis and suggestion. I found satisfaction in stripping the supernatural of its mystery, proving the mundane truths behind the myths. That's what drew me to the Bell Witch. It started one unremarkable night. I was scrolling through an online forum, the kind filled with urban legends and cryptic stories posted under anonymous usernames. Between tales of cursed dolls and haunted forests, one thread caught my eye. The Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee. A cursed family tormented by a relentless, malevolent entity. A cave steeped in dark energy where whispers are said to echo even now. It was a story of unimaginable fear passed down through generations. I couldn't resist. The Bell family's torment was something out of a nightmare. Objects hurled through the air, livestock mutilated, invisible hands striking them in the night. The father, John Bell, fell ill, his health drained by something no doctor could explain. And then there were the voices, mocking, hissing, and threatening in a cadence that didn't belong to this world. At the center of it all was the witch, a shadowy figure said to be the ghost of a woman wronged, her anger fueling her relentless attacks. The legends claimed that she lingered even after John Bell's death, her presence rooted to a cave on the family's property, a cursed cave. An open invitation to skeptics like me. I told myself I'd go for the history, to separate fact from fiction, to expose yet another myth for what it was. But deep down there was something else, a whisper of doubt. Maybe I wanted to be proven wrong. Maybe I wanted to believe. The drive to Adams was unremarkable at first, endless stretches of road framed by fields and clusters of trees. But as I approached the town, something shifted. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest like the weight of a storm on the horizon. The trees lined the road like sentinels, their shadows spilling across the asphalt, dark and oppressive. The town itself felt trapped in time. The peeling paint on the houses, the sagging porches, the streets empty of life. It wasn't just old, it felt forgotten. I stopped at a diner on the edge of town. A small bell jingled as I walked in, the sound startling in the oppressive quiet. The waitress greeted me with a tired smile, her kind eyes crinkling at the edges. She looked like someone who'd spent decades serving coffee and small talk. At first she seemed eager to chat. She asked where I was from, what brought me to Adams. But when I mentioned the Bell Witch, her smile faltered. She glanced around the empty dining room, as if expecting to see someone, or something, listening. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice low. I shook my head, and her expression tightened. She leaned closer, her hands trembling slightly as she poured my coffee. "Some stories aren't just stories," she said. "If you know what's good for you, you'll leave it alone." I laughed, brushing off her warning as small-town superstition. But her fear stayed with me. It wasn't the fear of someone clinging to folklore. It was the fear of someone who had seen too much. The cave wasn't hard to find. A faded wooden sign pointed the way. Bell Witch Cave. Enter at your own risk. It was tucked away at the edge of a dense forest, the trees pressing together as though they were trying to hide it. Standing at the entrance, I felt it again, that heaviness in the air, stronger now. The opening wasn't grand or ominous, just a small dark gap framed by moss-covered stones and twisted roots. It looked ordinary, but it didn't feel ordinary. The forest around me was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nerves, that I was letting the stories get to me. I was here for the facts, the history. But as I stepped closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The entrance to the cave was unassuming, almost disappointingly so. A small dark opening framed by moss-covered stones and twisted roots. It could have been the start of any ordinary trail, but there was nothing ordinary about the way it felt. The forest seemed to hold its breath around the cave. The air was heavier here, colder, as if the shadows between the trees had thickened, watching. There were no birds, no wind, just silence, dense and waiting. I wasn't alone. A small tour group had gathered at the cave entrance, their chatter subdued, their faces betraying a mix of curiosity and unease. At the front was a young couple, leaning into each other like they were on an adventure. The woman laughed, the sound light but forced, as though trying to mask the tension in her shoulders. Her partner had one hand on her back, the other holding his phone, snapping photos of the entrance. His movements were quick, almost jittery. Near the middle stood a teenage girl, clinging tightly to her mother's arm. Her wide eyes darted from the cave to the guide, her curiosity tempered by fear. Her father stood close, his hand resting on her shoulder as if to steady her. At the back of the group was an older man, his face set in a stoic mask. He seemed to scan the surroundings with quiet intensity, his flashlight already in hand, the beam resting on the forest floor. And then there was the guide, a wiry man with nervous energy that didn't match his practiced smile. His voice, when he spoke, carried the well-rehearsed tone of someone who had told the same story countless times, but there was something behind it. A flicker of unease he couldn't quite hide. "Welcome to the Bell Witch Cave," he said, his smile widening. "Over the years, many have come here seeking thrills, answers, or just a good story. But be warned, this place has a way of getting under your skin." I couldn't tell if he meant it as a joke. As he led us inside, the world seemed to shift. The sunlight at the entrance dimmed, swallowed by the mouth of the cave. The first steps were unremarkable, the ground uneven but manageable, the walls slick with moisture. But the deeper we went, the colder it grew. It wasn't just a temperature drop, it was a damp, invasive cold that clung to the skin, creeping into the lungs with every breath. The silence deepened, interrupted only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen. The guide kept talking, his voice bouncing off the walls in faint echoes. He recounted the history of the Bell family, their torment, and the stories of the cave. His words painted vivid images of the witch's cruelty, objects hurled across rooms, phantom voices, and a presence so malevolent it drove grown men to their knees. As he spoke, our flashlights illuminated the walls, revealing the first of the symbols. Jagged and uneven, they seemed to cut into the rock like scars. At first glance, they were just crude etchings, the work of some long-forgotten hand. But when the light shifted, they glimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Some say these are warnings," the guide said, his beam lingering on the carvings. "Others believe they're invitations." The young couple laughed nervously, their voices too loud in the confined space. The teenage girl asked her mother what the symbols meant, her voice a trembling whisper. Her father tightened his grip on her shoulder, murmuring something too soft to hear. I studied the carvings as we passed, my pulse quickening. There was something unnatural about them, as though they weren't meant to be understood, only felt. My hand itched to touch them, but the thought made my stomach turn. As the tunnel narrowed, the air grew heavier, each breath feeling like a small effort. Shadows stretched and twisted along the damp walls, their shapes shifting with the movement of our flashlights. And then it happened. It was faint at first, barely more than a flicker in my peripheral vision. A shadow, darker than the others, moving against the direction of the light. My rational mind dismissed it as a trick of the eye, but my chest tightened. I turned my head, scanning the darkness. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I swept it across the walls, the symbols glinting faintly in its path. There was nothing there. I told myself it was nothing. But then I heard it. My name. It was soft, almost a breath, but it was unmistakable. A single word spoken with a deliberate cadence. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The group moved ahead, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness, oblivious. I turned again, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The silence pressed against me, thick and oppressive. The guide's voice broke through the tension, calling us to move deeper. I quickened my pace, falling in line with the others. My hands were trembling, my grip on the flashlight too tight. I told myself it was an echo, a trick of the cave's acoustics, but the weight in my chest refused to ease. As we continued, the walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering until it felt like the darkness itself was pressing against us. The air was colder now, sharp and biting, the kind of cold that settles in the bones. The teenage girl clutched her mother's arm, her wide eyes fixed on the guide. "What's that?" she asked, pointing toward a dark recess in the rock. The guide hesitated, his practiced smile faltering for the briefest moment. "That's one of the smaller chambers," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Some say the witch rests there when she doesn't want to be disturbed." The girl's father gave a nervous chuckle, but no one else laughed. I glanced back at the recess as we passed, the beam of my flashlight catching on its edges. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadow sliding deeper into the black. I kept walking, my steps quicker now, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. The guide's voice continued, describing the cave's deeper legends, but his words were harder to focus on. All I could think about was the whisper, my name, spoken in the dark. It wasn't the last time I'd hear it. The deeper we ventured, the more the cave seemed to close in around us. The passage narrowed, the jagged walls pressing closer, forcing us to walk single file. The air grew colder, heavier, with each step, and the faint glimmers of light from our flashlights felt swallowed by the darkness. The symbols appeared more frequently now, their jagged lines no longer faint etchings, but glowing faintly with a soft, pulsating light. They seemed to grow more intricate the deeper we went, their patterns twisting and curling like something alive. The group was quieter now. The young couple who had laughed nervously earlier barely spoke, their flashlight beams darting rapidly over the walls. The teenage girl clung tightly to her mother, her eyes wide with fear. Even the stoic older man at the back had started glancing over his shoulder more often, his flashlight lingering in the darkness behind us, as though expecting something to emerge. And then the whispers started. At first they were faint, like the rustle of wind through trees, or at least that's what I told myself. But as we moved deeper, they grew louder, more distinct. They overlapped, rising and falling in a cadence that didn't belong to any human language. I could see it in the others too. The young woman clutched her partner's arm more tightly. The girl asked her mother, in a trembling voice, if she could hear it too. Even the guide, who had kept up his practiced narration, faltered for a moment, his flashlight beam jerking as his hand trembled. And then I saw it. A shadow moved ahead of us. Not the shifting shadows of our flashlights, but something deliberate, purposeful. It was tall, vaguely human-shaped, but its edges seemed to ripple like smoke caught in a breeze. It moved across the path and vanished into the darkness. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, but no one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they didn't want to acknowledge it. The whispers grew louder, their voices now so layered and chaotic that I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. They were closer now, surrounding us, threading through the heavy air like invisible tendrils. The guide stopped abruptly, his flashlight trained on the path ahead. The tunnel widened into a vast chamber, and as we stepped inside, the temperature seemed to plummet. The witch's chamber. The walls were covered in symbols, more than we'd seen before, glowing with an intensity that made them hard to look at directly. They pulsed in uneven rhythms, as though the rock itself were alive, breathing. The guide hesitated before speaking, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "This is where the stories are strongest," he said. "Some believe this chamber is a place of power, a conduit for the witch's energy. Others think it's a trap designed to contain her." His flashlight swept over the walls, illuminating carvings that seemed to twist and shift in the light. "Legend has it," he continued, "this is where she rests when she's not haunting the living. Or perhaps where she watches, waiting." The young couple stayed close together, their faces pale. The teenage girl pressed into her father's side, her mother whispering reassurances she clearly didn't believe. The older man at the back said nothing, his eyes fixed on the glowing carvings. I felt it again, that prickle at the back of my neck, the undeniable sense of being watched. I turned, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. The guide began leading the group toward the next tunnel, but I lagged behind. Something about the chamber felt wrong. My flashlight caught a faint glow in the far corner where the carvings seemed brighter, more intricate. It was a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The others moved on, their lights disappearing into the next passage, but I couldn't look away. The glow seemed to pulse in time with the whispers drawing me closer. My feet moved before I could think, carrying me toward the unmarked tunnel. The air grew colder as I stepped inside, the walls narrowing around me. The light wasn't coming from our flashlights anymore. It was coming from the carvings themselves, their jagged lines radiating an otherworldly glow. The whispers were deafening now, overlapping and chaotic, but one voice cut through the noise. My name. It was clearer this time, spoken with a deliberate, mocking tone. The tunnel opened into a smaller chamber, and the light from the carvings intensified, bathing the room in a cold, bluish glow. The symbols on these walls were different, more intricate, their patterns twisting and writhing like they were alive. The air was thick with the metallic scent of something sharp and acrid. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the oppressive darkness. And then she appeared. At first she was just a shadow, darker than the others, flickering at the edge of my vision. But as the light from the symbols grew brighter, her form began to take shape. She was impossibly tall, her limbs long and angular, moving in ways that defied logic. Her face was a grotesque parody of humanity, with hollow pits where her eyes should have been and a mouth that stretched far too wide. Her grin was sharp and unnatural, curving upward in a way that made my stomach churn. She moved toward me, her steps slow and deliberate, her body flickering like smoke. The whispers rose to a frenzied crescendo, and I realized they weren't just in the air, they were coming from her. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice low and layered, as though 100 voices were speaking at once. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my breath caught in my throat. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and a grin widened, splitting her face even further. Her skeletal hand reached out, the air around it growing so cold that it burned. As her fingers brushed my arm, a wave of numbness shot through me, spreading like frost. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their light casting jagged, twisting shadows that seemed to dance around her. "Leave," she hissed, her voice filling the chamber. "Leave, or you'll never leave at all." The paralysis broke, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the ground. The whispers followed me as I turned and ran, the narrow tunnel feeling impossibly long. When I burst back into the main chamber, the others were gone. Their lights had disappeared, and the silence was suffocating. I scrambled toward the next passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unsteady, but I didn't stop. The whispers faded as I caught up to the group, their murmured voices a strange comfort in the oppressive dark. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I didn't tell them that I could still feel her touch, cold and sharp like ice seeping into my skin. The guide led us toward the exit, his voice strained but steady, weaving more stories of the witch's wrath. But I didn't hear him. All I could hear was her voice, echoing in my mind, low and cruel. "You'll never leave at all." When I finally arrived home, I thought I would feel safe. The sight of my driveway, my front door, the familiar comfort of my own space, it should have been enough to ease the tension that had coiled in my chest since the cave. I wanted to believe that crossing that threshold meant leaving everything behind. But it didn't. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't anything I could see or touch. It was the air itself, heavy, almost alive, pressing against me like a suffocating weight. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind that comes with solitude. It was oppressive, buzzing faintly in my ears, as if the walls were holding their breath. I set my bag down and stood there, listening, waiting. The rational part of me tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the lingering effects of being in such an unsettling place. But deep down, I knew better. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the cave was there. The cold air, the jagged symbols glowing faintly, the suffocating darkness, it all came rushing back, vivid and unrelenting. And then there was her face. Her grin stretched too wide, her hollow eyes boring into mine. She wasn't just a memory. She was alive in my dreams, whispering in a voice that wasn't human. "You can't run. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I saw her shadow lingering in the corner of the room. But when I turned on the light, it was gone. That's how it started. At first, it was subtle. Small things I could almost explain away. My keys weren't where I left them. A door I knew I'd closed was slightly ajar. A chair was pushed back from the table as if someone had been sitting there. The whispers came next. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, threading through the silence like the hum of a distant radio. I'd catch them in the quiet moments, just on the edge of hearing. They were too soft to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Low, guttural, and filled with malice. The shadows were harder to ignore. They moved in ways that defied logic, stretching across the walls against the direction of the light. At first, I told myself it was a trick of my mind, that I was imagining the way they flickered and shifted. But then they grew bolder. One night, as I sat at my desk, I saw a shadow slide along the floor, long and jagged, moving with deliberate intent. It wasn't my shadow. It wasn't anyone's. I stared at it, frozen until it disappeared into the corner of the room. The mirrors were worse. I was brushing my teeth when I noticed it for the first time. My reflection moved out of sync. My hand raised the toothbrush to my mouth, but in the mirror, it lingered a moment too long before following. I froze, staring at the glass, waiting for it to happen again. But my reflection stared back at me, perfectly normal. The next time, it wasn't so subtle. I glanced into the mirror as I passed by and saw her. She was standing behind me, her hollow eyes locked onto mine, her grin impossibly wide. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirror, it was just me. The cold came next. It started in small pockets, a sudden chill in the air, a draft that shouldn't have been there. But soon it spread. Entire rooms felt like they'd been plunged into winter, the air sharp and biting. I'd see my breath clouding in front of me, the frost creeping along the edges of windows even when the thermostat read 70 degrees. The nights became unbearable. Sleep, when it came, was filled with nightmares. I was back in the cave, the symbols glowing brighter, the whispers louder. She was always there, waiting, her skeletal hand outstretched, her voice curling through the dark. "You can't run," she said. "You'll never leave." I'd wake up gasping for air, her voice still echoing in my mind. The bed felt colder than it should have, the blankets heavy and damp, like the air in the cave. The whispers grew louder, no longer confined to the edges of my hearing. They followed me everywhere, threading through the stillness of my home, blending with the sound of the wind outside, curling through the hum of the refrigerator. And then they said my name, Daniel. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was clear, deliberate, spoken in that same layered, inhuman voice. I started leaving all the lights on, thinking it would help. It didn't. The shadows stretched longer, moving with greater purpose. One slid across the ceiling, jagged and rippling like smoke caught in an unseen current. Another crept along the wall, its edges sharp and deliberate. I knew she was there even when I couldn't see her. One night I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She wasn't a shadow this time. She was solid, her towering form illuminated by the faint glow of the symbols that had begun to appear on the walls of my bedroom. Her grin stretched impossibly wide, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You're mine," she said, her voice reverberating through the room. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, pinned beneath the weight of her presence. The air was so cold it burned, each breath a struggle. She leaned closer, her skeletal hand reaching for me, and I felt the numbness spread as her fingers brushed my skin. When I blinked, she was gone. But the symbols remained, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the dark. I painted over them, scrubbed the walls until my hands bled, but they always came back. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was imagining it. But how do you explain the way your own reflection smiles at you when you aren't smiling? How do you rationalize the whispers that know your name, the shadows that move with intent, the frost that blooms on your skin when you're alone in the warmth of your own home? She wasn't just haunting me, she was claiming me. Every night her whispers grew louder. Every day the shadows stretched further. And through it all, her grin haunted me, carved into my mind like the jagged lines of the symbols on my walls. "You can't run," she said. "You'll never leave." And deep down, I knew she was right. It didn't take long for the haunting to intensify. What started as whispers and fleeting shadows became something far more tangible, something I could no longer dismiss as tricks of my imagination. The shadows no longer stayed confined to the walls. They moved with purpose, flowing across the floor and ceiling like liquid darkness. One night, as I sat on the couch, I felt it, a faint, icy touch brushing against my arm. I froze, staring at the empty air beside me, but the sensation lingered. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was her. The whispers were relentless now. They no longer faded into the background or hovered at the edge of hearing. They called my name, clear and deliberate, in that same layered, guttural voice. They followed me from room to room, filling the silence with an oppressive weight I couldn't escape. And then the messages started. At first, it was small things. My phone buzzed with notifications that didn't exist, blank texts from unknown numbers. My computer screen flashed static before returning to normal, as though something was trying to break through. But then, the messages became undeniable. One morning, I woke to find words carved into the wall above my bed. She's always been here. The jagged letters were deep, their edges rough and raw, as though scratched by something far sharper than a knife. I painted over them, trying to erase the evidence, but the next night they returned. This time the words were etched into the bathroom mirror, visible only when the steam from the shower revealed them. You're mine. I stopped telling anyone what was happening. The few friends I had confided in dismissed my fear as paranoia, suggesting I was overworked or stressed. One even laughed, calling it an overactive imagination. Their disbelief stung, but it also confirmed what I already knew. No one could help me. I stopped leaving the house. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, as though she was waiting just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispers followed me, threading through the sounds of the world, blending seamlessly with the hum of traffic or the rustle of leaves. Desperation drove me to try anything that might break her hold. I burned sage, letting the smoke curl through every corner of the house. I sprinkled salt across doorways and windowsills, muttering incantations I'd found online. I even tried praying, though I wasn't sure to whom. None of it worked. If anything, it made her stronger. One night, in a final act of desperation, I called a medium. She arrived the next day, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a calm presence that gave me a fleeting sense of hope. She walked through the house with me, pausing in certain rooms, her brow furrowing. "There's something here," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "It's old, and it's powerful." She offered to perform a cleansing ritual, and I agreed without hesitation. For hours, she chanted and burned herbs, her movements deliberate and precise. I watched as she traced symbols into the air, her voice steady, her focus unshaken. When she finished, she looked exhausted but hopeful. "The energy feels lighter now," she said. "I think it's gone." That night, the whispers were louder than ever. I woke to the sound of laughter, soft at first, almost a chuckle, but it grew louder, echoing through the house. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. The air turned icy, and the shadows began to move again, swirling around the room like a storm. The symbols carved into the walls glowed faintly, their jagged lines pulsing in time with the laughter. And then she appeared. She stood at the foot of my bed, her towering form flickering in and out of sight like a faulty projection. Her hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light, and her grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting her face in two. "You can't escape," she said, her voice reverberating through the room. "You're mine." I couldn't move. Her presence pinned me to the bed, the air around her vibrating with a low, relentless hum. She stepped closer, her skeletal hand outstretched, and I felt the cold seep into my skin, numbing everything it touched. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their glow casting jagged, dancing shadows across the room. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, overlapping until they became one voice, her voice. "You're mine," she repeated, the words sinking into me like claws. I don't remember how I broke free. One moment I was frozen, and the next I was running. I grabbed my keys and stumbled out the door, barely aware of the cold night air biting at my skin. I drove aimlessly, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The whispers followed me, threading through the static of the car radio, weaving into the hum of the engine. Every shadow on the road felt alive, stretching and shifting in the headlights, moving in ways that defied explanation. Her voice echoed in my mind, low and cruel, repeating the same chilling phrase. "You can't escape. You're mine." I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. But deep down I realized the truth. There was no escaping her. I thought leaving would save me. That if I could put enough distance between myself and the house, the town, the cave, I could leave her behind. But I was wrong. The car felt like my only refuge as I sped down the highway, the landscape blurring in the darkness. The hum of the engine was a steady backdrop, a rhythm I tried to cling to. But even there, she found me. It started with the radio. The static came first, faint and sporadic, before it grew louder, crackling and cutting through the soft music I'd turned on to drown out my thoughts. I switched it off, but the static didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was everywhere. And then I heard her voice. Daniel. She said my name, drawn out and deliberate, threading through the static like smoke. I glanced at the rearview mirror instinctively, and for a split second I saw her. Her hollow eyes staring back at me, her grin stretching impossibly wide. I swerved, my heart pounding, but when I looked again, the mirror was empty. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and I told myself it was just exhaustion, just my mind playing tricks. But I didn't believe it. I drove for hours through small towns and long stretches of desolate highway, stopping only when I couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. The motel was the kind of place people stayed when they didn't want to be found. The sign flickered weakly, the letters buzzing faintly in the cold night air. The room was sparse, just a bed, a desk, and a mirror hung crookedly on the wall. I didn't care. I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and collapsed onto the bed. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. But she wasn't done with me. The whispers started as soon as I turned out the lights. Faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder, overlapping in that chaotic, guttural cadence I'd come to dread. They came from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the air itself. The shadows moved next. They slid along the ceiling, pooling in the corners of the room, stretching and twisting in ways that made my stomach churn. One brushed against the edge of the bed, jagged and dark, and I felt the cold radiating from it, sharp and biting. And then she was there. She stood in the corner, her form barely solid, flickering like a candle flame. Her eyes burned with a cold, unnatural light, and her grin widened as she stepped closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You can't run," she said, her voice layered and echoing. I backed away, pressing myself against the headboard, but she kept coming, her skeletal hand outstretched. The air grew colder with every step she took, and the whispers rose to a deafening pitch, wrapping around me like chains. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn broke through the thin curtains, I grabbed my keys and fled. I didn't know where I was going, but my car seemed to move of its own accord. Every turn brought me closer to Adams, to the cave. I wanted to turn around, to drive in the opposite direction, but something pulled me back. The town was even quieter than before. The streets were empty, the houses dark. It felt like the entire place had been abandoned, as though it had been waiting for my return. The forest around the cave was denser now, the trees pressing closer together, their branches tangling overhead to block out the sky. The air was heavy, colder than it should have been, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. But I couldn't. The entrance to the cave was the same as before, small, dark, and unassuming. But stepping inside felt different this time. The darkness was alive, swallowing the beam of my flashlight, pressing against me from all sides. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter now, their jagged lines pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The air vibrated with a low hum, sharp and grating, sinking into my bones with every step. The whispers began almost immediately, louder than I remembered, their voices threading through the air like a chaotic symphony. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were inside me, weaving through my thoughts, unraveling them. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls pressing closer until it felt like I was being swallowed whole. The deeper I went, the brighter the symbols became, their glow illuminating the jagged carvings in sharp detail. And then I reached the chamber. The space was larger than I remembered, the walls covered entirely in glowing symbols that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air was so cold it burned, each breath sharp and painful. She was waiting for me. She stepped out of the shadows, her form more solid than before. Her limbs were impossibly long, her movements jerky, her body flickering in and out of sight like a broken projection. "You came back," she said, her voice dripping with malice. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and her grin stretched wider, splitting her face in two. She moved closer, her skeletal hand outstretched, the air around her vibrating with an unbearable hum. "You were always mine," she said. The shadows around her moved, twisting and writhing, their edges sharp and alive. They stretched toward me, wrapping around my legs, my arms pulling me closer to her. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their light searing into my eyes, their jagged patterns shifting and twisting like they were alive. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices blending into a single inhuman wail that reverberated through the chamber. I tried to move, to run, but the shadows held me in place, their grip cold and unrelenting. Her grin widened as she stepped closer, her breath icy against my skin. "You'll never leave," she said, her voice sinking into me like claws. The darkness pressed in, the shadows pulling me deeper until there was nothing left but her voice, her grin, and the cold. And then there was nothing. I wish I could tell you it's over, that I escaped, that the things I've told you are just echoes of a nightmare I've finally woken from. But I can't, because the truth is I'm still here. I don't know where here is. It's not the cave, not my home, not anywhere I can name. It's as though I'm caught between places, trapped in the spaces where the light doesn't reach. Time doesn't move here. Or maybe it does and I just can't feel it. I've stopped trying to understand it. I've stopped trying to fight her. She doesn't need my resistance. She thrives on my fear, my thoughts, my very being. You think you know who you are until someone or something takes it from you. At first I fought to hold on to myself, my memories, my voice, my will. But she's patient. She doesn't take it all at once. She lets you watch it slip away, piece by piece, until you're nothing more than a shadow. I used to believe in logic, in facts, in the comfort of what I could see and touch and explain. But logic is useless here. The things I thought I knew mean nothing now, because she's not bound by rules or reason. She's something else entirely, something older, something endless. She doesn't let go. I've tried to warn myself not to think of her, not to give her more space in my mind, but it's impossible. She's in every thought, every corner of my awareness. Even now, as I speak, I feel her, watching, waiting. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this. Not because I think I can stop her. I know I can't. But maybe, just maybe, you can save yourself. You might think you're safe. You're sitting there listening, probably telling yourself this is just a story. A voice you found by chance, a tale meant to entertain or unsettle. But that's the thing about her. She doesn't need you to believe. She only needs you to listen. That's how she found me. It started the same way. A story I thought was harmless, just words on a screen, whispers in the dark. I told myself it wasn't real, that I was untouchable, immune, but I was wrong. So I'll ask you this. Are you alone right now? Are you sure? Look around, pay attention. Have you felt it yet? The shift in the air, the prickle at the back of your neck. Maybe you've already noticed the shadows stretching longer than they should, or the silence lingering just a moment too long. That's how it starts. She's patient. She doesn't come all at once. She'll linger at the edges of your awareness, weaving herself into your thoughts, your fears, your life. You won't even realize it until it's too late. But you have a choice. You can turn this off. Forget you ever heard it. Maybe she hasn't found you yet. Maybe it's not too late. Or maybe you already feel her. If you do, there's nothing I can say that will save you. You can try to run, try to fight, but it won't matter. She doesn't stop. She doesn't let go. And if you think you can resist her, if you think you're stronger than I was, then remember this. I thought the same thing. But now I can't tell where I end, and she begins. The line between us is gone. She's always here, always watching, always waiting. And now she's listening too. Did you hear that? That whisper? I told you she doesn't need you to believe. She only needs you to listen.